Joining us now, defense attorney Misty Maris and trial attorney Terry Austin. Thank you both for being here on this July 4th. So, Misty, for a long time, the former president's legal team was just juggling so many cases, so many charges, so many states. Everything now seems to be a bit on pause. What do we expect that they're doing right now?
Well, it is on pause. That's absolutely the right way to say it. And the reason being, this new decision by SCOTUS relating to presidential immunity goes beyond just looking at the charges in these individual cases and making a determination about the charged conduct and whether or not that can move forward and falls under this umbrella of official acts. It takes one step beyond that. And that's because evidence relating to those official acts or whatever is deemed an official act can also not come into the courtroom, even if it's being used for another purpose other than the underlying criminal charges. It's being used to add context, to give the jury a roadmap of what happened, time frame, whatever that might be. So there's deep dive analysis with respect to all of these cases about what evidence is actually going to be at play as the potential charges are narrowed or changed given the Supreme Court's ruling.
Yeah, well, a lot to think about. And Terry, what about the prosecutors here in Manhattan? They agreed to delay the sentencing. It was supposed to be in July, right before the RNC. Now it's supposed to be in September. But they don't want their case thrown out. What are they doing?
Well, they're definitely preparing to determine whether or not the actions that they use to support the counts are determined to be official acts and whether or not they have that presumption to have that immunity. We don't have to worry about the counts being thrown out because that had to do with Trump's personal lawyer. It had to do with his personal payments, and all of that is quite personal. But what the prosecution is going to be doing is trying to determine whether or not that corroborating evidence. So, for instance, Hope Hicks, she was the communications director. That conversation that Hope Hicks had with Trump, where they talked about the fact that it would have been bad to have that story come out, is that evidence that can be used. If that's thrown out, the prosecution can always say, look, that was corroborated by David Pecker. He said the same thing. So I don't think Judge Merchan is going to throw out much of the case, if any of the case. Some of the evidence might be thrown out, but it's not material to what that jury decided at the end of the day. By the way, I sat in that courtroom every single day. Tons of evidence that shows there should have been a conviction and that jury would have convicted whether these other peripheral acts were in or out.
Yeah, really interesting to hear sort of that breakdown. Now, Misty, the Washington points out that there is a belief that Inauguration Day, not Election Day, is the deadline to prosecute Donald Trump before the rules against charging a sitting president kick in. Lawyers in the department, they report, do not believe the policy bars them from proceeding against a president-elect. Is that how you see it? Is a president-elect not able to sort of face criminal prosecution in the same way a president would here, Misty?
Well, so we're in uncharted territory, but this is certainly a valid argument that the government is raising and the prosecutors are raising, because the president-elect is not the commander-in-chief until inauguration. That's January 20th. And so based on the DOJ rules, that applies to a sitting president. So there's that technicality that in between Election Day and Inauguration Day, these cases can maintain and go full speed ahead, even though Inauguration Day is coming up. So there is a valid argument there for prosecutors to continue these cases. Now, again, because we're in uncharted territory, of course, you would see the defense side challenging that and making the argument that even though the president-elect is not technically the president of the United States until inaugurated, he does take on some aspects of the presidency during that time frame, like security clearances, participates in briefings, and so that's enough to preclude him from being prosecuted during that time frame. So those will be the two arguments that will be set forth. But look, I think prosecutors have a valid argument to keep these cases going straight through Inauguration Day.
Yeah, and Terry, Misty's talking about full speed ahead here, but even full speed ahead could mean that speed doesn't get you to a sentence and a trial before Inauguration Day. I wonder, are prosecutors here, do they think that there's a timeline where things could stand now, where there could be sort of a prosecution before Inauguration Day?
Well, don't forget, we have the New York case, and we could have a sentence before Inauguration Day in that case. And I think we will have a sentence before Inauguration Day because, as I said, I think many of those counts, all of the counts will stand. And at some point, there will be a sentence that is given. And there's just an adjournment for that to determine which of the evidence should be out. So that's going to stand. I mean, I think as far as the D.C. case is concerned, we already know Judge Chutkan, she has really sped this case along. She does not like delay. And I think she's going to have an expedited hearing, which is a mini trial. You're going to see the prosecution there, Jack Smith, they are going to put in as much evidence as possible. All the cards are on the table here. He wants to demonstrate, no question about it, that these acts are not official acts, or if they are official acts, the presumptive is that they don't have immunity and that he can prove that that's the case. So I think that that's going to be done quickly, and I think we will be able to get a trial even before inauguration. It'll be fast tracked, but I think that's possible. The other two cases, no. I think the classified documents case in Florida with Judge Cannon, that's already been marred with delays. And I think one of those delays is whether or not to appoint a special prosecutor. We saw in Judge Thomas's and Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, he just gratuitously said, there may not be any explicit authorization for the appointment of special prosecutors. So I think that case is going to go on for quite some time. And even the Georgia election interference case, that was a strong case. We have the call with Raffensperger, but I think that could be delayed as well because we know it's paused for the appeal to determine whether or not Fani Willis will have been or should have been disqualified.
Yeah, well, a lot of cases moving through and the Supreme Court really playing a critical role here. So thank you so much, Misty and Terry, for all of your analysis.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.